which brings the two halves of our day together, and that is that Tom Oden went to visit Henry Chadwick to speak with him about the ancient Christian commentary before it got off the ground. And that of course, must have been a conversation that we all would have wanted to be a fly on the wall to listen to about how that went. And so, in fact, the morning sessions and the afternoon sessions were united in those two very great men. So speaking of great men, it's my joy to introduce Father Hugh Barbour, who, Father Hugh grew up in Pasadena, and he went to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, to get a bachelor's degree in classics, after which he entered our Abbey in 1982, and his studies for the priesthood, of course, arrived him at the Holy Altar in 1990. He was a student in Rome, finishing his advanced degrees, a licentiate in patristic theology at the Augustinianum, and a doctorate in philosophy at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum. Father Hugh was the prior of our monastery, no small task, from 1995 until 2017, a very long tenure as prior. And like I said, not an easy job, as you can ask any prior. And he is doing, along those years, he taught many of the juniors and novices the history of our order and the life of St. Augustine, the life of our Holy Father, St. Norbert, and philosophy to the juniors. And he currently does many things, preaching retreats, working in parishes, and also is a chaplain, serves as a chaplain and a frequent writer for Catholic Answers in San Diego and elsewhere. Father Hugh.
Before I begin, the answer to the prison question, there is a lovely 17th century book which is in our general library, but you can also get on Google Books, and it's entitled Nemesis Norbertina, right? Seu de modo corrigendi in ordine premonstratensi, on the way of correcting in the order premonitory, and it describes in detail what is to be done with recalcitrant religious, and what they're allowed to read or what is read to them when they are kept for a while. So there is such a thing, and there it is. And our founding abbot Ladislaus, used to joke with me. He said, "Do you know the worst thing about the French Revolution? It wasn't the confiscations, is that we no longer had our own prisons." Well, recent history might indicate that maybe would have been not such a bad idea. That's the answer to that question, at least a partial one as regards our order. I won't describe the interrogation of the confrere who left and started preaching with the Calvinists and then was apprehended and brought back. Let's just say it wasn't very pretty. It involved duo fratres laici robustissimi, two very robust lay brothers. That's what it says in the description of the interrogation. So this was not the homey Augustinian environment, at least not at that point. And Augustine, as you know, was famously ambiguous and of two minds about the whole question of force in religion. So we can take his milder, earlier opinion for our own times. Before all else, most beloved brethren, let God be loved and then our neighbor, for these are the commandments most of all to be observed by us. The first purpose for which we have come together is that you may live in harmony in the house and that you be of one mind and heart toward God. Do not call anything your own, but let us have all things in common. For thus you read in the Acts of the Apostles, they had all things in common, and distribution was made to each as any had need. These words begin the received version of Augustine's Regula ad Servus Dei, his rule for the servants of God. The term servant of God meant monastic in his day. And that's the origin, or clerical monastic at least. That's why the popes call the servants of God. It originally meant servant of the other clergy, but now it's taken to mean everybody, which is fine, but in any case, just so you know. It is in this grand evangelical and apostolic perspective that the concise rule that follows is to be understood, including the words which form part of the title of this talk, Codices ex certa hora et singulis Diebus Petantur, ex horam qui petierit non accipiat. Let books be requested at a determined hour each day. He who asks outside this hour may not receive one. The present narration is of the struggle of one community of canons to observe the rule regarding the care and use of books held in common, which are in principle the only ones we possess. I say in principle. This has been a very long struggle, lasting from 1180, when our mother Abbey of Certa in the western county of Sopron in the Kingdom of Hungary was first listed among the houses of the rapidly expanding order of Premontre, until the present day, indeed to this day precisely. The present gathering of friends is a real part of this continuous history of some 842 years. I thank you in advance of your hearing this narration in the name of all who have come before and now rest in Christ for your taking part in it. Not the least of these happy souls is our founding abbot who rests in the hope of the resurrection in the Abbey church crypt nearby, awaiting the final fulfillment of his motto, Succisa Virescit, as we heard last evening in Dom Columba's lucid prelusion for our time together. This is no hyperbole. That is your friendship and the historical significance of your presence. It is a simple fact. As a Magyar would say, köszönöm szépen, thank you kindly. One fine, humid day in midsummer in 1925, a 10-year-old named Franz Pöker received a note at home in his ethnic German village of Großdorf. Up to the previous year, in the aftermath of the Great War, this village was in Austria, in what was hopefully then called by the inhabitants Deutsch West-Ungarn, German West Hungary, but part of Austria. Now it was again part of Hungary, as it had been always until a few years after the war. But the Hungarian Regency was pursuing a firm policy of Magyarization, that is, Hungarianization. And so little Franz Pöker was now to be known as Ferenc Keresztesi, and his village Német Kerestes, the Magyar for German Großdorf. The note was from the headmaster of the Premonstratensian Gymnasium in Szombathely, some 10 miles east. Szombathely was the Roman Sabaria, the oldest town in Hungary, the birthplace of St. Martin of Tours. It was still known also by its German name, it still is, if you Austrians living in the neighborhood, of Steinamanger, and its Croatian name of Subotište, which might explain why they didn't let this become German West Hungary. There are a few other people there as well. Little 10-year-old Ferenc had received a scholarship for room and board in the name of the 13-year-old Archduke Otto von Habsburg, son and pretended heir of the last emperor of Austria and the last apostolic king of Hungary, the now blessed Karl IV. He was a war orphan and so eligible for the scholarship. His father, Gabriel Pöker, had died in Albania the year he was born. So off he went on his bicycle, wondering what was the matter. When he reached the school, he was brought in before the headmaster and mathematics instructor, Eugene Szymonfi, who would later become his abbot in the Abbey of Certa, which he was later to join. Without looking up, the stern man called him to his desk, and still without raising his eyes, pushed a letter toward him. It was a letter of thanks the boy had written to the Imperial and Royal Majesty for the gift of the scholarship. The priest placed his index finger where the date was supposed to be and told him to write it in. He had forgotten to place it there. Never forget to date your letters ever again. All letters are historical documents. Good day. The boy, who later said he had felt as though he had committed the crime of lese majestatis, wrote in the date, in his fine copperplate hand, the loss of which he would later lament, and then rode his bicycle back the 10 miles home amid the Blaufränkisch vineyards owned and worked by his grandfather and mother. When he told me this story, he was Abbot Ladislaus of this canonry of Premonstratensian or Norbertine canons in Orange. He went on to say that had he not received the scholarship from the dethroned but hardly fading House of Habsburg, he would have been a wine grower as his father and grandfather had been. Jokingly, with his Central European sense of the vagaries of history, and cynicism too. Central European professors are often very cynical, which is delightful, of course. With that sense of the vagaries of history, he said, with my temperament, I might have ended up the local party chairman instead of an abbot and priest of Christ the Lord. So thank God for this, the scholarship, without which none of us. The Abbey of Chorna, from which our founders came in a truly dangerous escape through Soviet-occupied Eastern Austria in 1950. Remember, this is not 1956. It was not easy to get out. They had minefields, they had all of that. And which Ferenc joined after his graduation from our gymnasium in 1933, had already a long history. It had from the start, in 1180, been a very local institution, a small abbey patronized by a succession of noble families, last among whom were the Esterhazy, whose gift of an amazing abbatial ring, by the way, our Abbot Eugene inherited and wears at Christmas and Easter. So if you want to get a glimpse, a little bit of bling, in the candlelight, that's when you come. 10,000 hectares with their villages, a ship on the Danube trading down to the Drava in Serbia, all supported the abbey and its mostly parochial duties from the 12th century until the Turkish domination of the 16th and 17th centuries. The kings of Hungary were noted for using abbeys and chapters as offices of public records. And the Abbey of Chorna was one of these, so-called locus credibilis, whose abbot or provost also took care of local law enforcement, possessing intermittently, as things became unstable before the Ottoman invasion, the jus gladii, the power to give sentence in civil and even capital cases. Now there's an abbot. Just a little beyond the prison theme here. The abbey had an ever-expanding archive, but was not endowed with a fine library, as even many less prosperous abbeys were. This archive survived by its zealous removal, 4 fires in the 12th, 15th, 16th, and 18th centuries, as well as during the Turkocracy. The archive was returned from Vienna or Bratislava to the restored abbey after the Turks had left, was removed again during the suppressions of the Emperor Joseph II, the notorious Enlightenment sacristy emperor, about whom more later in the 18th century, returned again in 1803, and continued to be kept by the canons until 1874, when the state took over the notary archives. The survival of the archive may be explained by the fact that the abbey itself lay just 20 miles within the little slice of so-called Royal Hungary that remained during the Ottoman rule. Her lands, however, lay well within the Turkish Empire, and so the emptying of the abbey. In the 50s of the last century, the communists moved the archives to Sopron, the county seat, where they remain to this day, amazingly intact in a country which has over the centuries lost an incalculable number of precious records to war and occupation. So what of the headmasters? Never forget to date your letters. They are historical documents. There you see. Speaking as though for a biblical oracle, we can say that the fulfillment of this type, the abbot's words, in the reality of our abbey's life, was the happy day of the arrival of Henry Chadwick, the Henry Chadwick collection, gifted to us by the kindness of Howard and Roberta Amundsen and the Dan Murphy Foundation of Los Angeles, which provided us with quite an archive. The notes and correspondence of Chadwick relative to the Anglican-Roman Catholic dialogue, initiated in the 60s by Archbishop Michael Ramsey and Paul VI. I noticed that Paul VI gave Ramsey a ring, and John Paul II a stole, perhaps a sign that, after all, he was always to have been spared a bishopric. That is Chadwick. Chadwick led the Anglican side, of course, and his papers are all here cataloged and recorded and awaiting the interest of scholars of that then very hopeful effort. Perhaps there is among them some effective and useful indication of what direction things might take in the future. Who knows? Church history is what we are living, and he was both a student and an agent of that history. Of course, archives and libraries are different, if related, things. But what are the books? That's what this is all about. Our Mother Abbey was deeply engaged in parochial, pastoral, and administrative works in her earliest centuries. But there is no record of any notable holdings of books. This was the case even into the 18th century. After the defeat of the Turks, the grand Baroque university town Abbey of Radisco in Moravia obtained our Mother Abbey of Chorna with her lands, very important point, from the imperial chancery in Vienna in order to restore the Premonstratensian life there. There is extant today in the Abbey's ecclesiastical archive, which were always completely separate from those of the kingdom, an inventory of the books sent to Chorna in 1711 from this very wealthy sponsoring abbey. Now, this abbey had a fine library in the Central European style, with the Deccan frescoes of Paul Troger, which you can still see today. It was right by the university in Olomouc. But what treasures from its abundance did it send to Trona? A grand total of 25 volumes. And what are they? A Bible, a missal, an antiphonor, a processional, a hymnal, a psalter, a breviary, a manual for parish priests, an examination of conscience, a prayer book, a formularium, that's for writing letters, a lectionary, readings from the lives of the saints, sermons from the saints, the rule of our Holy Father Augustine, and the Corpus Juris Canonici, the collection of canon law which preceded the codes we've been using since the 20th century. St. Augustine's Contra Faustum, St. Augustine's sermon on the Lord's Sermon on the Mount, Cassiodorus on the soul, Aristotle on the soul, and Aristotle's Physics on generation and corruption, and medicinal treatises of Avicenna, a summa of cases of conscience by Bartholomew of Pisa, and a ritual book for the right administration of sacraments and sacramentals. So, you have fundamentally a modest collection for parish priests, just the most essential works for the canon's worship, service, and instruction, and confessional practice, and medical services, as well as the beginnings of philosophical study preparatory to theology. You might remember as a point to our students that even the Dominicans didn't study beyond the physics in those days. They went from, they did the physics study, and then they went and studied the scriptures, and if they wanted to do theology, then they got metaphysics. They made them wait. No fine collection here, a sacristy collection, utterly unremarkable except on one point. There was nothing to indicate the inroads of the Enlightenment, which would undoubtedly be represented in the collection of the great abbeys of the day. Surely we can see the practically exact parallel to the Carolingian monastic holdings described last evening by Dom Columba. Practically 1,000 years had passed, but the sensibility of what was most essential in the way of books had not changed a whit. Cassiodorus, imagine. In 1786, under Joseph II, the abbey was suppressed, along with 700 other abbeys of the several orders throughout the Austrian Empire. Their lands and goods were consolidated and reorganized in order to meet the expectation of an enlightened state which saw monks and canons better occupied in useful works of education of young men and secular clergy. This is the soft Enlightenment, the soft Freemasonry of the Austrian world. They didn't slaughter them. They just had better things for them to do than singing God's praises all day, which they still had to do. Most of the quiet, prosperous local abbeys of the Middle Ages were no more. There was, of course, especially in Hungary, a popular outcry against this change, otherwise largely welcome to the diocesan bishops for whom the abbey churches became parochial holdings, but still alien to the centuries-long experience of the people. In 1802, the Emperor Francis I restored the abbey with its lands under the condition that it undertake the running of 2 gymnasia, a classical gymnasium in Szombathely, the one to which Abbot Parker went, and a scientific gymnasium in Kaszthely by Lake Balaton. Yet these were school libraries, not monastic abbatial ones. The confreres engaged in teaching had their own personal collections. The common possession of books enjoined by the rule was far out of sight, even if an abbey had a substantial collection of its own. An 18th century commentary on the rule by a canon of Klosterneuburg by Vienna gives us an insight into the state of affairs. Canon Augustin Ristel, in his Commentarius in Regulam Divi Augustini ad usum canonicorum, commentary on the rule of Augustine for the use of canons, tells us that surely the rule is to be interpreted as encouraging daily sacred reading and study. He points out that the limitation on receiving books there pertained to a time when there was no typographical art, but that current times permit the canons to retain books for their use in number and in their own cells. For this, he brings forward the up-to-date authority of St. Francis de Sales, who saw the invention of printing as the occasion of a mitigation of the earlier discipline, allowing only one book at a time each day. St. Augustine, he is sure, intends by this rule to foster access to books and would have seen the matter differently had he written in 17th century France. One doctor against another, but there you go. And so it came about that common possession was a canonical fact, but private retention of books technically possessed by all had become the norm. This approach was undoubtedly that of our mother Abbey, since once she became a promoter of sinners for the learning for the young. It was, in fact, a canon of that same Stift Klosterneuburg, Canon Clemens Galban, who was, by the way, the man who first introduced our community to Howard and Roberta Amundsen in the Knots. So it's the same abbey. The history of the Friends of Monastic Libraries is a small one and connects across the centuries and indeed across the globe. But this introduction to our friends will lead well beyond the private canonical congeries of books familiar to Canon Ristel. It will lead back to the rule and the world from which it arose. When our founders came to this country, the same loose personal discipline prevailed. There was a modest collection for the needs of the converse in formation and philosophy study, and a small but adequate collection for our preparatory school, but still nothing like a monastic library. The canons who taught had their own small libraries in their rooms, collections of history, classics, German and French literature, theology, philosophy, order history, canon law, and even physics were to be more reliably sought out and borrowed from their respective teachers than in the library. Such a state of affairs never satisfied our founding abbot, Ladislaus, nor his successor, Abbot Eugene, nor for that matter, the sub-prior, Father Hubert, who tried hard to resist this tendency as well, although his personal library was the best in the Abbey, of course. But he took care of them. Thank God he had it, because those books are well taken care of. And so gradually the Abbey collection began to grow in the mid-80s of the last century until the present. Our Abbey has generally, throughout her history in Hungary or in California, taught the philosophical course required for ordination in-house. We are careful disciples of St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, as our early countercultural vocational advertisements proclaimed from the late 60s on. But where were the works of St. Thomas? They needed to be obtained, and extensively, as well as the relative secondary literature. A cleric does not study from manuals alone, but as much as possible from the very words of his authorities. It was at this time that we received some bequests which allowed us to purchase books in number. Now, these classics were not easily found, many barely in print. To the rescue came a marvelous work, Loom Booksellers of Stillwater, Minnesota. Dr. Thomas Loom, who was a doctor of theology of Tübingen, specializing in the history of 20th century modernism in the Catholic Church, decided to turn from academia and sell theological and philosophical books. And this is a historical and very important development in the life of the Church, not just in the States, but in the English-speaking world most of all. I mean, there are collections of books from Loom's in Macau, in the seminary there. I know because I went and selected the books as a favor to him one February in the warehouse in Minnesota with gloves on. It was something else. They were getting them for free because, of course, it was a missionary effort. But they don't speak Portuguese anymore there. They speak English, the seminarians. Into his store, which was an old Swedish covenant church, flowed the libraries of numerous closed and consolidated Catholic seminaries, principally of religious orders. The collection was stunning. Everything was there in those days, everything. Stable Benedictine and canonical houses, however, did not sell off this patrimony, having known the depredations of the state over centuries in Europe. Why would they sell their precious inheritance of books? I don't know of any Benedictine abbeys selling off their libraries. They would give to another Benedictine abbey, but they weren't selling them off, as far as I know. I won't provide the identities of the alienating communities, but any use of our books will reveal which seminaries and faculties and congregations were disbanded by their library markings. Focusing on basic subsidia like the Dictionnaire de théologie catholique or the Dictionnaire d'archéologie chrétienne et liturgie, d'histoire ecclésiastique, de droit canonique, the Kirchenlexikon, the Bibliotheca Sanctorum, and other encyclopedic sets, nevertheless, we were most concerned to obtain a full collection of the scholastic authorities. Thus, we acquired on a single, very memorable buying trip the works of St. Thomas in the Leonine Critical Edition and also the Parma edition, the Thomistic commentators Cajetan, Sylvester Ferrara, John of St. Thomas, the Carmelites of Salamanca, as well as the works of Alexander of Hales, Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, and Suarez, as well as numerous monographs. It's quite a load. And you can imagine Loom's reaction when I said, he said, what are the terms? I said, well, we'll just pay for it now. And he looked at me like he could not believe it. So I think that became a famous incident. But in any case, it wasn't because we were rich. It was just because I didn't have the sense to bargain with him. So. It was already a bargain, believe me. Yet, with all this scholastic stuff, all the schoolmen lined up and arrayed with their numerous arguments, we're quite conscious of where their arguments come from, principally from the fathers. The fathers of the church had to be present in our library, for a study of the schoolmen is simply vain, thin manualism without them. That's all it is. Don't ever think that St. Thomas fixes and corrects the fathers with his responses, unless you've read the whole treatise of the father in question and then looked at St. Thomas's use of his quotation and find out. But he does not correct the fathers much. He forms them in terms of the current argument. I just grow tired of Thomas correcting Augustine, right? Just put that out of your minds, please, everybody. Right? He may ignore certain things that Augustine says in favor of others, but he does not correct him. Loom located a complete set of sources chrétiennes from the deceased patrologist Father Eno of Catholic University, and we purchased modern editions of the works of Augustine and Means Patrologia Graeca and Latina on microfiche. That's ancient technology for people here. These big, we still have them, the big cartons full of the microfiche, and then the reader, and then trying to find the spot, and then if you're in a library, you could put dimes in a machine and get it photocopied off of the microfiche thing. And I found out in Catholic University Library that the machine didn't work very well, and so if you could use the same dime, and all you had to do was go like that. It would give you, and I was getting tired of collecting dimes, and I said, I don't care, I'm going to go to the desk and I'll pay with cash, paper money, but I cannot bring all these dimes. I had to copy a lot of stuff. So I would stand there, I would sort of straddle the machine and go like that with the same dime. Anyway, then the auspicious day arrived when I received a call from Looms informing me that the personal library and papers of Henry Chadwick were available from his family. I taught for some years the course on St. Augustine, and so was eager to investigate. I did not wait an hour to knock on Abbot Eugene's door to tell him of the possibility. He was used to my knocking on his door. But he told me right away that if I could find a donor, then we would acquire them. And so it was that I called upon the aid of Howard and Roberta Amundsen, whom, as you recall, I had met through an Augustinian canon of Vienna, our mutual friend, Father Clemens. Howard answered yes in a letter, but challenged me to find another donor as well to pay for a half. I know this is very good technique when you're constantly being berated by people for money. And I interpreted it that way. I said, they really want to give it to us, but they want me to do some work. So I contacted the Dan Murphy Foundation in Los Angeles, which is a Catholic foundation, and they kindly and immediately agreed. I could not believe our good fortune. It was also proof that Orthodox Calvinists and Orthodox Catholics can unite in support of a monastic library, an example of ecumenism en acte, very much in the spirit of Chadwick. Yes, there are the 39 Articles and the Westminster Confession, the Tridentine Profession of Faith of Pius IV, Luther's Small Catechism, but about books and art and dinner, we are all together of one accord. Perhaps, though, if you're an Arian or Pelagian, there is no thought of camaraderie, but only business. This is rather an ecumenism of the non-ecumenical, just by historical necessity, but not any other reason. The folks from Looms arrived with the books. Now, Dr. Loom had created a small community out of his staff, many of whom have since given their life's work to antiquarian and rare books. It was a genuine culture of the diffusion of a patrimony which stood to be lost after the upheavals of the 60s and the 70s. Material patrimony that was going to be lost. Of course, the collection had to be cataloged. So for the first time, we hired a qualified archivist and librarian, Mr. Derek Reekins, from Minnesota, himself an alumnus of Loom's business. First off, the Chadwick collection would be cataloged, and then we could proceed to cataloging the rest of the existing Abbey collection. It wasn't already cataloged, you ask? Well, there you are. The arrival of the Chadwick collection is much more significant than the collection itself. It actually moved forward something that was absolutely essential if we were going to observe the rule of St. Augustine in any sense at all. This mammoth forged-through task has been taken up by Mr. Thomas Kaiser, also of the Loom Raum, our present librarian archivist. For the first floor library, which houses the special collections and reference works, continues below in the moving stacks in the Abbey basement. These men have done splendid work, both possessed of an active faith and appreciation of what we intend to accomplish. And we pray daily for Thomas Kaiser, our present librarian, for his perseverance in our sometimes wild west of books. If you could see some of it, you'd recognize that this is not an exaggeration. So it is now our Augustinian and patristic and late antique holdings that surpass our Thomistic and scholastic ones. This would not have troubled Henry Chadwick. I found in his edition of the Summa St. Thomas, practically the only Thomistic or scholastic work in his collection, only one marginal note in pencil. There were many marginal notes in many of his books, but only one marginal note in all the volumes of the Summa, because I thought I wanted to see this. And it is at the point at which Aquinas says that clerical celibacy is an ecclesiastical discipline and not a divinely revealed one. Henry and Peggy Chadwick, although now, as Christ taught the Sadducees, neither married or given in marriage, enjoy the full eschatological meaning of this insight in the company of Aquinas and the similarly celibate angels of God. So it all works in the end. Yeah. And that trumps ecclesiastical anything, the promises of the Savior. Once our library is entirely cataloged and organized, then the real work will begin of maintaining, pruning, and updating our holdings. In short, we will have a professionally credible and accountable collection. Finally, books may be requested in good order and returned in good order. We are well on our way to fulfilling the intention of St. Augustine's rule. Things take time. Our young men in formation are now more and more up to the task of making fruitful use of what we possess in common. Latin and Greek knowledge have made tremendous strides, I would say astronomical strides recently. It's now popular to do all this spoken Latin stuff, and they go to these conventions and whatnot. And being raised in the Pauli Visova, Anglo-German style of classical philology, there was never any thought. Composition, yes. Slavish imitation of styles, yes, and composition, but speaking, it was just not even imagined. So I found it hard to believe, Latin is a language, but until I started hearing it among certain ones. And not only that, when once one of our juniors was sitting in the library in front of a Zoom class with a Greek professor, speaking very cheerfully and chattily in classical Greek, and I mean speaking. So they'll be able to use all this stuff, and if it's just the right moment. Scripture studies and canon law collections will be expanded well and thoughtfully. Duplicates will be conserved for eventual new canonical foundations from our abbey. You see, since 1180, our community here or in Hungary has never been able to rest in the happy possession of a fully functioning monastic library. We are not simply restoring, we are founding a culture here, an ocean and a continent away from where our founders began. And we are beginning to fulfill the rule according to which we are vowed to live in common. But this is not all. We have built an abbey which can stand for centuries, hopefully until the Savior comes again. And so until then, we intend to take our books with us until even the most recently published text or tome becomes an old or rare book. The Codex is easily the most important technological advance in the history of Christendom. And now we've been given palpable evidence of this in the awe-inspiring Amundsen donation of the Thomas Oden collection of incunabula and rare books. A few of these you have seen in the library on display. After the Codex, printing is the next great technological advance. The earliest volume we possess is a Confessor's Manual from 1470. Dare we imagine that we might acquire some manuscripts as well? A step back in technology, but a witness to continuity. St. John's Abbey in Collegeville undertook the precious task of producing a manuscript Bible, of which we have a facsimile, some volumes of which you will have seen in the library. These things can be done even now. After all, our Father St. Augustine never saw or handled an integral Bible. Think of that. Never saw one. Something we take for granted. He had only manuscripts of discrete canonical books. Even the conversion, it's the letter of St. Paul to the Romans. It's not the whole Bible. Right? Even so, he knew the scriptures better than we do. Technology is not everything then, and being incompetent in the matter, I cannot comment on eventual digitalizations of what we have now. Books cannot be shut down from a satellite or hacked by an act of technological warfare. We will always need them for our security in the local transmission of the word, which is real, living, and active, not virtual. There is more. We are also set to receive the future bequest of Dr. William Mart, Assistant Professor of Music at Stanford and head of the Church Music Association. This is the 10,000-volume collection focused on liturgical studies. In addition, we have received from Mr. John Blackley, his Schola Antiqua, the collection of early medieval chant and early polyphony. Henry Chadwick's contribution to the revision of church music in the Church of England remains where it belongs in the jurisdiction it serves, but as an accomplished and authoritative church musician in his own right, he surely will be happy at these further fine additions to our library. And finally, back to the rule, and in conclusion, St. Augustine gives us a final exhortation. The Lord grant that you may observe what is written here in affectionate charity as lovers of spiritual beauty. Ut observeti sec omnia cum dilectione, tamquam spiritualis pulchritudinis amatores. With this precept, we are led into the considerations of next week. For the doers of the word, and not only its hearers and readers, produce the beautiful in ourselves, our souls, and our bodies. And to end on a mildly Anglican note, that is, in order to be a reasonable, holy, and living sacrifice to the God who has, in this place, overwhelmed us with his gifts. To him be the glory, world without end. Amen.